listening to the Today's Mama podcast with your host, Rachael Hersher.
Happy season of gratitude, everyone. I've got a quick solo episode for you this week, just me and the mic. If you just can't get enough of me and the Today's Mama podcast, we've got so many good episodes in the archives. You can find a list of those at todaysmama.com/podcast or in whatever app you are listening on. Enjoy. As we head into Thanksgiving, we're taking it easy this week. I've got no new interview, but I have been thinking a bit about gratitude. And for me, so much of my gratitude has to do with Friday the 13th. It was Friday the 13th of August, 2010. I just finished dinner with my parents at a restaurant with my 3 kids, who were at the time 6 years old, 5 years old, and 18 months old. My husband was on a climbing trip with his buddies in the Tetons, and I had finally gotten the call from him that he was off the mountain safe. Now, that's when I exhale. That's the call I'm always waiting for, because every time he goes on a trip with his buddies, I worry that something bad will happen while they're climbing. So I wait for that call when they're off the mountain, and then I can relax. I tucked my phone away, put it in my purse, enjoyed dinner with my family, intent not to worry about his safety anymore. About an hour later, we left that restaurant. And when I got in my car, I pulled my phone out, and I had a message and missed calls. And they were from numbers that I didn't know, but they were from Wyoming. He had been climbing in the Tetons, which is outside of Jackson Hole. And of course, my irrational brain goes to, those are numbers I don't know. That's bad. And then I listened to my voicemail, and it was the local hospital in Wyoming. And I thought, that's bad. And my brain kept going and going, only with each step to be confirmed that this was worse. This was worse. So as I was getting this news, I, in all of my composure, sent my kids to ride home with my parents. Nobody knew what was going on. And I got in my car to drive home, listening to the messages and calling the nurse at the hospital back. She then told me that my husband had been in a head-on collision and that he'd broken his back and he was in critical condition. And she didn't have any news for me beyond that. Turns out he was in a truck, and the driver of that truck had fallen asleep at the wheel, and they had had a head-on collision with a big Ford F-350. Now, they were in like a little Tundra. As you can imagine, they got crunched, and they were going 65 miles an hour. So I've said this before on the podcast. On that drive home, I pulled into a parking lot of a church, actually, and I sat there after I hung up with the nurse, saying over and over to myself in my head, this is not our story. This is not how it's supposed to go. This is not our story. And then I started making phone calls. I called everybody in my husband's family, and guess what? I got voicemail every time. This was one of those last weekends in August. It was mid-August, but before school was going to start. So everybody went out of town. My husband's parents were out of town. He's the oldest of 6 kids. I think 4 or 5 of the 6 were out of town. And I left desperate voicemail after desperate voicemail, working myself up to a frenzy. He ultimately was life flighted from Jackson, Wyoming to Salt Lake City to Intermountain Medical Center, which was the level of trauma care that he needed. All the while on that flight, he was bleeding internally, and they didn't know it. So his injuries were pretty bad. I remember waiting in the waiting room at the hospital, staring at the window for every helicopter to touch down. And when they brought him in, all he could say to me was, I'm so sorry. And he looked horrible. And I tried to memorize his face as they took him away for surgery. And I waited hours. The doctor said, it'll be just a couple hours and I'll be out and I'll be able to give you some updates. Well, 2 hours turned to 3 to 4 to 5. And then finally, the doctor came out and said, listen, I don't know what to tell you to expect. Stitching him up was like sewing together wet tissue paper. And I anticipate we're going to have to do 10 to 15 surgeries on him to get him where he needs to be. So they had removed feet of his intestine, repaired different parts of his body. They didn't seal him up all the way because they knew they'd be going back in for more surgery. So about 48 hours passes and they take him back in for his second surgery. And miraculously, the surgeon came back out and said, hey, I was able to close him back up. Blood flow is returning where it needs to. Things look like they're doing really well. So we're going to be able to stitch him up and not have to do those extra surgeries besides the ones to fix his back. Miracles, right? At every turn, at every corner of this experience, I found so many miracles. Now, On the opposite hand, to add insult to injury, literally we were in the very smallest window of our lives where we didn't have health insurance. I remember sitting in the hospital terrified for that inevitable moment when someone would walk to his ICU room and ask me for our health insurance information. I irrationally prayed that they would not unplug my husband. You see, this wasn't the beginning of hard for us. We'd already had a hard couple of years that had been weighing me down. Just about 2 years before, my sister passed away from cancer. She died on September 27th, 2008. Remember that big, huge stock market crash? That thing that seemed to kick off the Great Big Recession? That happened on September 29th, 2008. The recession was not fun for my business or my husband's business. This accident was really about midpoint of a lot of heavy stuff for me. And when I say midpoint, it's because after his accident and in all his recovery, this would be followed by some health issues for me and a string of miscarriages that broke my heart. I felt like I had a 5-year span of pretty heavy stuff. But after all of that, we're okay. We're more than okay. We're happy. Let me tell you why I think we are. The weeks surrounding my husband's accident seemed the darkest, the most unsure. But each day, I'd go on a walk with one of my kids, and we'd talk about every good thing that happened that day. Every meal that was brought, every card received, the secret someone who anonymously paid my kids' lunch money, every single little triumph in my husband's health and in our lives we focused on, and we focused hard. I kept a notebook, and I wrote down every grace, big and small, that happened. I didn't want to forget, and I didn't want my kids to forget. So here's the thing. We could look back on Friday the 13th as the worst day that ever happened to our family. But through it all, we look at that day as one of our very luckiest. We expect good things on Friday the 13th because it's the day my husband Mark lived. It's the day he survived something really big and scary. It's the day that luck and what feels like a million other people were on our side. Now, that thought process I had a choice in that. I can frame that whole experience however I want, and I can stick to that story. So here's what I choose. I choose to see it that way. And that's what gratitude does. It allows us to reframe the broken, messy things in our life and give them meaning. So whether you're hearing this during the holiday season or discovering this episode years from now, my challenge for you is to find that thing that needs some reframing and to pour as much gratitude around it that you can. You might not be grateful for the thing itself, the accident, the pain, the unkindness, but what surrounds it? Who surrounds it? Where's the magic? Where are the miracles? A favorite quote of mine is from Albert Einstein, and he says, "There are only 2 ways to live your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle. The other is though everything is a miracle." You're in charge. You get to give this big, crazy life we're living meaning. And another quote that popped into my Instagram feed this week, and I'll put a little graphic image in the show notes, but this is the one I want to leave with you this Thanksgiving, and which to me sums up the whole of this experience. Gratitude unlocks the fullness of life. It turns what we have into enough and more. It turns denial into acceptance, chaos to order, confusion to clarity. It can turn a meal into a feast, a house into a home, a stranger into a friend. Gratitude makes sense of our past, brings peace for today, and creates a vision for tomorrow. That's from Melody Beatty. So this Thanksgiving and holiday season, I wish you all the gratitude your heart can hold. You can find the show notes for this week's episode at todaysmama.com/podcast. I'll be sure to highlight the couple of quotes I mentioned and include a few crazy photos from that fateful Friday the 13th and the weeks that followed. Thanks as always for listening. Be sure to tune into next week's episode, number 22, with Shannon Martin of shannonwrites.com. And it's so good. Our coziest episode yet.
You've been listening to the Today's Mama podcast with Rachael Hersher. To find out more, go to todaysmama.com. That's today's, MAMA.com. Today's Mama, connecting moms and families with the best of today.